There are stories that begin with a gunshot, and stories that begin with a whisper. This one begins with a number called out across a dusty town square on a Tuesday morning in May. 1887. It is a story about what happens when a man who has stopped living spends every dollar he has on something he cannot explain, and a woman who has lost everything discovers that dignity is the one thing no auction can sell. It is about burned cornbread and mended calico and an old dog who knows more about people than people do. It is about the kind of courage that never raises its voice. If you have ever felt unseen, or if you have ever watched something wrong happen and known you had legs to walk toward it, this story was written with you in mind. Settle in, take your time. The coffee's hot. The auctioneer's voice carried a practiced flatness, the kind a man uses when he wants the words to mean less than they do. Labor contract. 6 months of domestic service. Highest bidder holds the contract and pays the debt directly to the county court. The contracted worker receives no wages. The labor itself satisfies the obligation. Sheriff Burrell read from a handwritten document, his arthritic fingers pressing the paper against the wind. He did not look at the girl standing 3 feet to his left. He had not looked at her once since she stepped onto the platform. Martha Weaver kept her eyes on the hills. The ridge south of town ran in a blue-gray line where sky met rock. And she fixed on it the way a swimmer fixes on the far shore, not because it was close, but because looking at it meant not looking down, not at the 15 or 20 people gathered near the livery stable, not at the woman in the silk-trimmed hat who had leaned toward her companion and said, not quite softly enough, "That's the auction girl. Amos Weaver's debt." Her father's pocket watch sat in her skirt pocket. Gold-plated. Chain broken. Hands frozen at 4:17. She had wound it that morning in her boarding room while the coal oil lamp still burned. The mechanism did not catch. It hadn't caught in 3 months, not since the week he died. She wound it anyway, the way you'd say good morning to someone who couldn't hear you anymore. 30 cents a night. The boarding room cost. She had 4 nights left. "Bidding's open," Burrell said. His voice cracked on the second word. He folded the paper and stepped back. A man near the front, Dale Perkins, young, red-faced from the ride, raised his hand. $10. Harlan Cobb sat in a straight-backed chair someone had carried out from the saloon for him. He did not raise his hand. He simply spoke. 20. The way you'd order a drink, Dale whistled through his teeth. "Moving quick there, Harlan. I know what I'm buying." Martha's fingers found the watch through the fabric. She pressed until the case dug into her palm. The metal warmed against her skin. She did not move. 2 townsmen stood near the edge of the platform, close enough that she could hear them over the scrape of boots and the creak of the livery gate. How much she owe? 47 to Cobb's Mercantile, 5 in court fees, 52 total. $52 for 6 months' work. That's cheaper than a hired man. That's the point, ain't it? Dale Perkins bid again. 25, Cobb. 30. The crowd shifted. Someone laughed a short bark, the kind that comes from watching something you know is wrong but aren't willing to stop. Mrs. Garfield adjusted her hat. The banker's clerk checked his pocket watch, a real one, gold, ticking. Martha watched the hills. She had thought, walking here this morning, that she would feel something sharp. Fear. Maybe. or the hot flood of shame she'd felt the day the court notice arrived, that white slip of paper tacked to the boarding house door where everyone walking past could read it. Amos Weaver, deceased. Outstanding debt, $47. Filed by Cobb Mercantile. Remedy labor contract auction per territorial statute. But standing here, she felt something else, a stillness, the way the surface of a pond goes flat before a stone hits it. Everything held, everything waiting. 35, Dale said, but the grin was slipping. Cobb didn't even turn his head. 38. Dale shoved his hands in his pockets, rocked on his heels. She's all yours. Harlan. He laughed. And this time the laugh had teeth in it. Break her in, gentle. 3 men laughed. One woman, the preacher's wife, standing at the far edge, turned and walked away. Martha's hands began to shake. She pulled them from her pockets, folded them in front of her, one over the other, fingers laced. The tremor ran through her knuckles like a current through wire. She pressed her thumbs together until the nails went white. Anyone watching from a distance would see a young woman standing straight and still on a platform in the morning sun. Calico dress pulling at the elbows where the thread was wearing thin. Composed. Steady. Only someone standing close enough to see the knuckles, would know. Cobb looked up at her now. Directly. The way a man looks at a horse he's already decided to buy, checking the teeth as a formality. You know how to starch a collar, girl. Martha said nothing. Can you iron a shirt proper? Not just flat proper. Creases where they belong. She looked at the hills. You'll learn, Cobb said. And something in his voice, not cruelty exactly. Something worse. Something comfortable made the blood drain from her hands entirely. The bidding was over. Everyone knew it. Burl was reaching for his pen. And then the crowd moved. Not much a shift. A parting. The way water moves around a stone dropped into a stream. Someone was pushing through from the back, and the people who recognized him stepped aside not out of fear, but out of surprise. The way you'd move for a man you hadn't seen in daylight for years. Martha heard the footsteps on the hard-packed dirt. Heard the murmur, "That's the Brooks hermit, the one whose wife." She did not look down, but she heard a leather pouch hit the sheriff's table. She heard coins. She heard paper money being counted, bill by bill, with the deliberate patience of a man laying down the last of something. And then a voice she had never heard before. Low, unhurried, flat as a fence rail. 52. The square went silent. If this story reminds you of someone you've known, someone quiet, who did the right thing when it cost them everything, we'd love to hear where you're watching from today. As the old folks used to say, pull up a chair. You're among friends. Burl set the leather pouch on the table, counted the coins. Twice? $52. He looked at Elias. That clears the debt, the court fees, and then some. You understand the terms 6 calendar months domestic service, no transfer, no subletting. Contract expires November 27th. I understand. Cobb stepped forward. The brass fittings on his wagon, parked 10 feet behind the crowd, clinked as his matched bays shifted in the harness. The sound cut through the murmur of voices like a coin dropped on a church floor. That's above the assessed value, Cobb said. The court set the debt at $47 plus $5 in fees. He's overpaying. Harold Ford leaned on his cane at the edge of the platform. Man wants to overpay. That's his business. Or are you saying you'd like to match it, Harlan? Cobb's jaw worked. He looked at Elias at the worn boots, the faded coat, the empty leather pouch on the table. A man who had just spent everything he owned on a piece of paper. You'll be paying more than her debt's worth, Cobb said, and the whole town'll know it. They already do, Elias said. Burl wrote the contract on the courthouse steps. Harold signed as witness, Mrs. Dalton, the preacher's wife, who would come by the cabin every Thursday to check on propriety. As she did for every household without a married woman in it, signed second. The ink dried in the heat. Martha came down the platform steps. Her left knee buckled on the last one, a small hitch, the kind a body makes when the ground it expected isn't where it should be. She caught herself on the railing, straightened. Elias was already at the buckboard. He didn't offer his hand, didn't look back to see if she was following. He climbed onto the bench seat and took the reins, and sat. Martha walked to the wagon. Stopped. "Can you drive a mule?" he said. "I can learn." "He don't listen to me either." She climbed up. The bench seat was warm from the sun. It smelled like pine tar and old leather. Elias clicked his tongue. The mule leaned into the traces. The wagon rolled. Behind them, an old dog came around the corner of Harold's store, gray-muzzled, one eye clouded to milk, moving at the pace of an animal who had stopped hurrying years ago. Ember had followed the wagon to town the way she always did on supply days. At her own speed, by her own road. She reached the tailgate and stood, front paws on the board, waiting. Martha looked back, reached down, helped the old dog up. Ember settled in the wagon bed, turned once, lay down, put her chin on Martha's knee, the weight of it 7 pounds of gray head. Warm through the calico was the first living thing that had touched Martha willingly in 6 months. Her hand moved before she knew it was moving, fingers finding the spot behind the ear where the fur was thin and soft. In her pocket, the watch sat still. The hands read 4:17, same as always, same as the afternoon her father wound it for the last time and set it on the table beside his bed and closed his eyes. The town fell away behind them. The road opened. 4 miles of dust and grass and silence ahead. Martha counted the fence posts on the way in. 11 broken. 3 leaning at angles that would give in the next hard wind. The wire between them sagged in loops. Rust-colored. Catching grass and old tumbleweeds that nobody had cleared. The road, if it could be called a road, was 2 ruts worn into dry earth. The mule knew it by heart. Elias held the reins loose, and the animal picked its own way. Ears forward. Hooves finding the hard ground between the ruts. 4 miles from town. 4 miles from the last building Martha had seen, which was the livery stable at the edge of the settlement, its roof patched with flattened tin cans. She watched the land, rolling grass, brown at the tips, green underneath where the roots still held water. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property. She could see the cottonwoods that marked it, their leaves silver in the afternoon light. A red-tail hawk circled high and lazy above the south pasture where a handful of cattle stood in the shade of a rock outcrop. The cabin came into view around a low rise. Hand-hewn logs, dark with age, chinked with something that had once been white and was now the color of old bone. A porch ran the width of the front, the boards warped and gray, the rail leaning outward like a man who'd had too much to drink. 2 posts held up the porch roof. One was straight, the other wasn't. On the porch, a rocking chair, silver-painted wood, the paint peeling in long curls. The seat was dusty. A cobweb stretched from the arm to the porch rail, a single thread. Undisturbed, meaning nobody had sat in that chair in a long time. Beside it, nothing. No second chair, no table, just the rocker and the empty boards and the cobweb catching the light. The garden was dead. Or rather, it had been left to die. The difference mattered, though Martha couldn't have said why. A fence of cottonwood stakes surrounded a plot 20 feet by 30. Inside thistle, foxtail, the dried stalks of something that might have been tomatoes 2 seasons ago. A hoe leaned against the fence, its blade orange with rust. The soil was hard and cracked, but it was dark soil, the kind that had been worked before, turned and fed and planted, soil that remembered what it was for. Elias pulled the wagon up beside the porch, set the brake, climbed down without speaking. Martha climbed down on her side. Her boots hit the packed earth of the yard. Ember jumped from the wagon bed, or tried to. Her back legs caught on the tailgate, and Martha reached back and steadied her. Hands under the old dog's ribs. Lowering her the last foot to the ground, Ember shook herself, walked to the porch, lay down in the shade. Elias opened the cabin door, stood aside. Martha went in. The kitchen was the first room, the only room that mattered in a cabin this size. A cast-iron stove, cold. The pipe running up through the roof. A pine table, hand-planed. The grain showing through a surface that had been oiled and scrubbed and oiled again over years. 2 straight-backed chairs, a shelf above the stove holding a coffee tin, a sack of flour, 3 cans of beans, and a Bible with a cracked leather spine. The window over the basin faced east. The glass was dirty but whole. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, not the dust of abandonment, but the dust of a man who lives alone and doesn't notice. The stove had grease on the burner plate. The table had a ring where a coffee mug sat every morning in the same spot. The basin had a cake of lye soap, dried and cracked. Signs of use without care. A life maintained at its lowest functional level. He led her down the short hall. 1 door on the left, his room, she guessed, from the boot prints in the dust on the threshold. 1 door at the end. He opened it. A narrow room. A bed built into the wall pine frame. Rope supports. A corn husk mattress that rustled when the door's draft touched it. A wooden crate beside the bed, serving as a table. A kerosene lamp on the crate. The chimney glass smoked gray. 1 window, east-facing, with a curtain made from a flour sack. Hemmed neatly small. Even stitches. The work of someone who sewed well and often. On the bed. A quilt. Blue and white, double wedding ring pattern. The interlocking circles stitched so tight, and even they looked printed rather than sewn by hand. The fabric was cotton calico blues, white muslin, pieces cut from what must have been dresses and aprons and pillowcases, each piece chosen for its shade. The binding was hand-finished, the corners mitered. This was not a quilt made in a week. This was a quilt made over a winter, maybe two, by someone who had time and patience and a reason to make something beautiful for a bed in a room at the end of a hall. "Door's got a latch," Elias said. "Use it if you want." He left. His boots went down the hall. The screen door opened, stretched, closed. Martha stood in the room. She set her bag on the crate, one bag. Canvas, holding the calico she wore. A faded brown work dress, older than the debt. A hairbrush with a cracked handle. And the watch, everything she owned. It fit in a bag the size of a flour sack. She'd carried heavier groceries. She sat on the bed. The corn husks shifted and crackled under her weight. She reached for the quilt, lifted it to her face. Pine smoke. Lavender faint. Almost gone. The ghost of a sachet tucked between folds. And underneath, the smell of cotton that had been ironed before it was folded. Pressed flat with a heated, sad iron by someone who believed that even the things nobody saw should be done right. She held the quilt against her cheek. Breathed. What her father would say about this arrangement, a young woman under a single man's roof, she already knew. He'd say, "Judge a man by what he does, not what it looks like." He'd said that about the Haskell family when nobody else in town would speak to them. He'd said it about the preacher who drank. He'd said it the morning before he died. About nothing in particular, just because it was the kind of thing he said. Martha put the quilt down, smoothed it flat, stood. Through the window she could see the dead garden, the thistle, the rusted hoe, the good dark soil under all of it, waiting. She went to the kitchen. Evening. The stove was hot, and the cabin smelled like smoke and something burning. Elias stood at the stove with a cast iron skillet, scraping at cornbread that had fused to the bottom. The coffee in the pot was the color of creek mud and smelled like it had been boiled twice. Maybe 3 times. He put a plate in front of her, cornbread black on the bottom, raw in the middle, dry on top. A cup of the mud coffee. A tin of beans, opened, set on the table with a spoon in it. Martha looked at the cornbread, looked at the coffee, looked at Elias, who was already eating his portion with the steady determination of a man who had stopped expecting food to taste like anything. "How are you still alive?" she said. He stopped chewing, looked at her. His jaw worked once, twice not chewing, processing. "Ember eats the worst of it," he said, under the table. Ember's tail thumped once against the floor. Martha's mouth moved. The corners pulled sideways. A sound came out short, sharp, surprising. She was laughing, not much, not loud, but real. Elias looked at her the way a man looks at a sound he hasn't heard in a long time and can't quite place. Then his mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same territory. He went back to his cornbread. They ate. The coffee was terrible. The beans were cold. The cornbread was an insult to corn. Ember ate the worst of it. After supper, Elias went to the porch. Martha washed the plates in the basin, 2 plates, 2 mugs, 1 skillet, 1 pot. She dried them with a rag that had been a shirt in another life. Through the window she could see him. He sat on the porch step. Not in the rocking chair. The rocker was 3 feet behind him. Empty. Its cobweb intact. He sat on the step with his boots in the dirt and his elbows on his knees and looked at the hills going dark against the last of the light. Ember lay beside him, her chin on her paws. Her clouded eye and her clear eye both pointed west, where the sun was going down behind the ridge in bands of copper and rust. Martha dried the last mug, hung the rag on the nail above the basin, stood in the kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and lye soap and pine smoke, and listened to the crickets starting up. One by one, in the grass outside. She went to her room, latched the door, sat on the bed. The quilt was still where she'd left it. Blue and white. Double wedding ring, stitched by hands she would never meet, for a bed she was sleeping in a house that belonged to someone she didn't know. She pulled the quilt over her lap, ran her fingers along the binding. "Whose quilt is that?" she said, to the room, to the lamp, to nobody. But she already knew. The lavender told her, the ironing told her, the cobweb on the rocking chair told her. The question wasn't whose. The question was what happened to her. The smell woke him. Coffee. Not the mud he'd been boiling for 4 years. Not that scorched, bitter tar that sat in the stomach like gravel. This was different. This smelled like coffee was supposed to smell. The way it had smelled when Margaret made it. The way he'd forgotten it could smell. Elias lay in bed. The rope supports creaked under him as he breathed. Morning light came through the window in a flat band, catching the dust in the air. He listened. Sounds from the kitchen, the stove grate being lifted, set back, the coffee pot being moved, the soft scrape of the coffee tin lid. He got up, pulled on his boots, walked down the hall. The kitchen was clean, not just tidied clean. The grease was gone from the stove plate. The window over the basin was clear, the glass wiped inside and out, and morning light poured through it in a way it hadn't in years. The table surface showed its grain, the pine Margaret had oiled every month, that he'd let go dull and sticky under a film of spilled coffee and flour dust and neglect. The shelf above the stove was organized coffee tin, flour, sugar, beans, Bible, in order. The floor had been swept. The cobweb in the corner above the door was gone. Martha stood at the stove. She wore the brown work dress. Sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hair was pinned back. She poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and set one at his place, the ring on the table where his mug always sat. She'd noticed the ring. She'd put the mug exactly on it. He sat, picked up the mug, drank. The coffee was hot and strong and tasted like coffee. "You've been grinding it too coarse," she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She was wiping the stove plate with a rag, her back to him. The beans need to be fine. Almost powder. Otherwise the water runs through too fast and you get—" She stopped. "Well, you know what you get." She sat across from him, drank her own coffee. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove ticking as the iron cooled and Ember's nails clicking on the swept floor as she came in from the porch and lay down in the patch of sun by the door. "It's good," he said. Martha looked at her mug. The corner of her mouth moved not a smile, just an acknowledgement, the way a person accepts a coin they've earned. He left the seed packets on the table after breakfast. No note. He put them beside the sugar tin and went out to check the south fence. Tomato, squash, beans, marigold. 4 paper packets, each one printed with a picture of what was inside. He'd bought them from Harold's store 2 months ago, or was it 3? Before the auction. Before any of this. He'd bought them because Margaret always planted by June, and his hands had reached for them on the shelf the way they reached for things she'd wanted. Even now, even when the garden was dead and the hoe was rusted and there was nobody to plant them for. He'd put them in the kitchen drawer, forgotten them, found them this morning when Martha opened the drawer looking for a paring knife. She hadn't said anything. She'd looked at them, looked at the drawer, looked at the garden through the window, put the knife down. So he'd put the packets on the table and left. By afternoon, the garden plot was open. Elias came back from the fence line to find Martha on her knees in the dirt. She'd pulled the thistle and the foxtail by hand. He could see the pile beside the gate. Roots and all. The soil still clinging to them. She'd taken the rusted hoe and broken the surface of the plot, working the hard crust into something that could be turned. Her forearms were streaked with dirt. Her brown dress was dark at the knees. He got the spade from the barn, didn't say anything, started turning the soil on the far end of the plot while she worked the near end with the hoe. They worked toward each other. The soil opened up dark, rich, the smell of it rising in the afternoon heat, that heavy mineral smell of earth that has been fed with compost and ash and coffee grounds and kitchen scraps over years. Margaret's soil. The soil she'd built from nothing, bucket by bucket, season by season. Martha opened the seed packets. Read the backs. Measured distances with her hand, a span for tomatoes, a fist width for beans, 3 fingers for squash. She'd done this before. Her hands knew the work. She dropped the first tomato seeds into the furrow, pressed the soil over them with her palm, a flat, firm press, the heel of her hand pushing the earth down and then smoothing it with her fingers, packing it just tight enough to hold moisture, but loose enough to let the sprout push through. Elias's spade stopped. He was standing 4 feet away, mid-swing, the blade 6 inches above the dirt, his hands locked on the handle. His arms didn't move. That gesture, that exact gesture, palm flat, heel pressing, fingers smoothing. He'd watched it 10,000 times from this exact distance, standing in the garden with the spade, while Margaret knelt in the dirt and pressed the seeds in with her hand. That same hand, that same motion, the same unconscious certainty of a woman who knew what soil needed. Martha looked up. Something wrong. He drove the spade into the ground. Hard, the blade sank to the shoulder. No! He dug. Didn't look at her. Dug until the sweat ran down his back and soaked through his shirt, and his shoulders burned, and the plot was turned from one end to the other. Martha planted behind him row by row, seed by seed, palm pressing the earth flat. They didn't speak. The work filled the space where speaking would have gone. Evening. Porch. Martha sat on the step. Elias stood against the post, his arms crossed. The light was going that long. Slow fade that happened in late May. The sky holding its color for an hour after the sun went down. the hills going from brown to purple to black, crickets, the creek, just audible. Ember stretched across the top step, her back legs twitching in a dream. Martha looked at the rocking chair. The cobweb was gone. She'd cleaned the porch that morning, swept the boards, wiped the rail, but the chair was still empty. Nobody sat in it. "That chair's going to rot if nobody sits in it," she said. She was looking at the hills, not at him. "Wood needs weight. My father used to say that about chairs and about people." Elias didn't move. His arms stayed crossed. His jaw tightened. She couldn't see that. He was behind her, but he felt it. The muscles pulling, the teeth pressing together. The chair was 3 feet away, silver paint, peeling, Margaret's chair. She'd picked it out of a catalog, the only thing she'd ever ordered from a catalog. Everything else she made, or grew, or did without. It had come on the freight wagon from Prescott, and she'd painted it herself. On the porch, on a Tuesday afternoon. Silver, because she said silver was the color of the moon, and the moon was the only thing that stayed up later than she did. He uncrossed his arms, took 1 step, turned, sat. The chair held him. The rockers found the worn grooves in the porch boards, the grooves Margaret's rocking had worn over 6 years. The slight depressions that guided the chair forward and back in the same arc, the same rhythm. The wood creaked, not the creak of failure, the creak of a thing doing what it was built to do. He rocked. Once, twice. Ember's tail thumped against the step. Martha didn't look back. She sat on the step and looked at the hills and listened to the creak of a chair that had been silent for 4 years and said nothing. Later, after dark, Martha in her room. The door latched, the lamp lit. Elias stood in the kitchen. The table was clean. The seed packets were gone. Martha had taken them to the garden and brought back the empty papers, but she hadn't thrown them away. She'd cut the printed pictures from the fronts and pasted them onto strips of brown paper and written labels underneath in a neat. Slanted hand, tomato, squash, bean, marigold. The labels were tied to mason jars on the windowsill, jars filled with water and dark soil. Each one holding seeds she'd started early. Backup plantings, in case the garden rows failed. Elias touched the jar labeled marigold. The paper was smooth under his finger. The ink was fresh. The seeds inside were dark specks suspended in wet soil, waiting. Margaret grew marigolds every year, orange and yellow, along the border of the garden, because she said they kept the beetles away, and because she liked the way they looked when the sun hit them. The last marigolds had bloomed the autumn before she died. He'd let them go to seed. Let the seed fall. Let the garden die around them. This woman he didn't know had found the seed packet in a drawer and planted marigolds in a mason jar on the windowsill of a dead woman's kitchen and labeled it in her own handwriting. And he was standing in the dark, touching the glass with 1 finger, and the chair on the porch was still warm from his weight, and the crickets were loud and steady, and the night was clear, and he didn't know what to do with any of it. He pulled his hand back, went to his room, lay on the bed. Through the wall thin pine boards. Barely an inch between his room and hers, he heard a small, metallic sound. A winding. A clicking. The faint, tight resistance of a spring being turned. Then silence, then the winding again, and again, the same rhythm, the same resistance, the same silence after, She was winding something that wouldn't catch. Elias lay in the dark and listened to the sound of a thing trying to start and failing. Over and over. On the other side of a wall, he could have put his hand through. He closed his eyes. The rocking chair on the porch sat empty and still. The marigold jar on the windowsill held its seeds in the dark. And through the wall, the winding continued, patient, persistent, expecting nothing, stopping for nothing. The days took on a rhythm after that first week. Coffee before dawn. Martha ground the beans fine, the way her father had taught her, the heel of the hand pressing the grinder handle in slow circles. Feeling for the moment, the resistance changed from grit to powder. Elias drank his mug, standing at the kitchen window, looking at the south pasture. He said, when it was good, which was every morning, and nothing when he wanted more, which was also every morning. She learned to pour the second cup without asking. 3 weeks in, the garden had rose. Green shoots pushed through the dark soil 2 inches of bean sprout, the furred leaves of squash seedlings, tomato starts from the mason jars transplanted into the ground, their stems thin but upright. The marigold border was coming in along the fence. Small orange buds forming at the tips. Martha watered morning and evening, carrying buckets from the creek. She drove the buckboard to Harold's store on a Tuesday. Elias's supply list was in her pocket. Coffee, flour, salt, lard, a tin of baking powder, fence staples. The mule knew the road. Ember followed at her own pace. The way she always did, the store smelled like sawdust and molasses and the leather of new harness. Harold was behind the counter, weighing nails. He looked up when the bell rang, nodded. "Miss Weaver? Mr. Ford, Harold. She gave him the list. He read it. Pencil behind his ear. Lips moving, turned to the shelves. The front door opened. 2 women came in, Mrs. Garfield, in a green dress too tight at the waist, and a younger woman Martha didn't recognize. They stopped when they saw Martha. Mrs. Garfield's eyes moved from Martha's face to her boots, to her sun-browned forearms, and back to her face. "Well," Mrs. Garfield said. She said it to the younger woman, but loud enough for the store. "There she is, living out there with that hermit. No chaperone, no ring." She picked up a tin of peaches from the display, examined it as though it contained information. "You know what they call her? Auction girl. Playing house with a dead man's ghost." The words entered Martha's ears and traveled down her spine and settled in her stomach like a stone dropped in still water. Her hands were on the counter. The flour sack was under her right palm. She pressed her fingers into the rough burlap and held. Her ears rang. The store was very bright and very small. Mrs. Garfield set the peaches down, picked them up again. The younger woman looked at the floor. Harold came back with the salt and the lard. He set them on the counter, looked at Mrs. Garfield, looked at Martha, his eyes small, sharp, older than the rest of his face, moved between them. "Mrs. Garfield," he said, "either buy something or go gossip on your own porch. Small town's got a small mouth, but it never shuts." Mrs. Garfield's chin lifted. Her nostrils flared once. She set the peaches down with a click and walked out. The younger woman followed. The bell rang twice, once for each of them, and then the store was quiet. Harold wrote the total on a slip he'd send to Elias, put it on the tab, helped Martha carry the supplies to the buckboard. "Don't let her under your skin," he said. He was lifting the flour sack into the wagon bed and his voice was flat, directed at the sack more than at her. "She's been saying the same kind of thing about the same kind of people since before you were born. It's the only hobby she's got." Martha untied the mule, climbed onto the bench seat. The leather was hot from the sun. "Mrs. Dalton comes by Thursdays," she said, "to check on things. You know that. I know that. She knows that. The whole town knows that." Harold leaned on his cane, squinted up at her. "The people who matter know the truth. The ones who don't matter know what Mrs. Garfield tells them. Always been that way. Won't change." Martha picked up the reins. The mule stamped. "Harold? Yeah, thank you." He waved her off, turned back to the store. She drove. The road unrolled 2 ruts through grass. The hills on both sides. The cottonwoods along the creek catching the afternoon light. A meadowlark called from a fence post 2 notes. Rising. Then silence. Martha pulled the mule to a stop at the creek bend, a half-mile from the cabin. The water ran shallow over flat stones, making a sound that was not quite silence and not quite speech. She set the brake. Sat. The road east went to Prescott. 30 miles. She could make it in a day if she walked fast, 2 days with rest. There was laundry work in Prescott, boarding houses that hired women to cook and clean. She could pay her own way, owe nothing. The contract didn't chain her. It was a debt paid by labor. And if she left, Elias couldn't force her back. He wouldn't. She knew that the way she knew the coffee, and the seed packets, and the door latch, he would not come after her. She could go. She sat on the bench seat and looked at the road east, and felt the pull of it, the clean simplicity of leaving, of being nobody's story, nobody's gossip, nobody's auction girl. Then she thought about the coffee, the way Elias said, and it meant 3 different things depending on the pause before it. The bean sprouts pushing through the dark soil, 2 inches tall, reaching. Ember's chin on her foot under the table at supper, the rocking chair creaking on the porch at dusk, his weight in it now. Every evening, the first time in 4 years, because she'd told him wood needed sitting in. She thought about the quilt, the lavender, the ironing. She thought about what her father would say, not about the gossip about the leaving, walking away from something that wasn't finished. He'd push his glasses up his nose and look at her over them and say nothing, which was the loudest thing he ever said. Martha picked up the reins, turned the mule toward the cabin. She was quiet that evening, not the quiet of their first days that had been the quiet of 2 strangers sharing a house, the careful silence of people measuring the distance between themselves and the walls. This was different. Elias noticed, because Martha was never truly quiet. She hummed when she cooked. She talked to Ember. She said things to the garden, not to him. To the plants themselves. Small instructions that he caught through the open window. This evening she made supper without a sound. Set the plates, ate, washed up, went to the porch. She sat on the step, looked at the hills, said nothing. Elias stood in the kitchen. The plates were drying on the rack she'd fashioned from bent wire. The stove was cooling. Through the window he could see her, her back straight, her hands in her lap, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening for something she couldn't quite hear. He went to the shelf above the stove. The Bible was where Martha had placed it when she'd organized third from the left. Spine out. He pulled it down. The leather was cracked along the spine. The pages were soft and yellowed at the edges. The last time he'd opened it was the day of Margaret's funeral, when the preacher read from Psalms, and Elias stood beside the grave with dirt under his fingernails from digging it himself. He carried it to the porch, sat in the rocking chair, opened the Bible to Psalms, found the 23rd. He read aloud. His voice was rough, unused to this purpose. The words caught in his throat, not from emotion, from disuse, the way a gate catches when the hinge has rusted. He stumbled over restoreth and had to go back. He lost his place in the valley of the shadow and had to find it with his finger on the page. Martha didn't move. She sat on the step, and her breathing changed a long exhale. Slow, the kind of breath that happens when something lets go in the chest. Not a sigh. A release. He read the 27th. The Lord is my light and my salvation. His voice steadied. The words came easier now, not smooth, not practiced. But finding their way out the way, water finds its way through a cracked dam. One trickle, and then another. He read the 34th. Oh, taste and see. The lamp on the kitchen table threw light through the window, and the porch was half lit, half dark. And the crickets were steady, and the creek was steady, and his voice was becoming something close to steady. "Thank you," Martha said. He stopped, looked at her. She was still facing the hills. Her hands were in her lap. Her back was straight. "There's more," he said. "If you want." "I want," he read. Psalms, one after another. The words of a king who'd done terrible things and knew it and sang anyway. Elias read until the lamp guttered and the porch went dark, and the only light was the stars, and the only sound was his voice, and the crickets, and the creek. He closed the book. The leather was warm from his hands. "Same time tomorrow," he said. "If you want." "I want." She went inside. He heard the latch on her door, the corn husk mattress rustling as she lay down. Elias sat in the rocking chair, the Bible on his knee. The night was warm and still, and the stars were close, and Ember was asleep on the step, and the world was exactly as large as this porch, and no larger. He rocked. The chair creaked in its grooves. Somewhere in the kitchen, a cricket had found its way inside and was singing from behind the stove. One high, steady note that didn't stop and didn't waver and didn't ask for anything. On Monday, Harold would make his monthly ride out to check the fence line he shared with Elias's western boundary. He'd sit on the porch and drink bad coffee and talk about the weather and the price of feed. But this time, Martha realized as she lay in the dark. The quilt pulled to her chin, Harold would see the garden, the clean kitchen, the 2 chairs on the porch. And Harold would go back to town and people would ask and Harold would answer, because Harold Ford answered every question the same way with the truth. And the truth, in a town that ran on gossip the way a stove ran on wood, could be more dangerous than a lie. Cobb came on a Wednesday, 6 weeks into the contract. Elias was at the south fence, tightening wire with pliers and rawhide gloves. A 1/4 mile from the cabin, Ember lay in the shade of the nearest post, panting slow. The sun was high and white, and the air tasted like hot grass and iron. He heard the wheels first, then the hooves, 2 horses, heavy, well shod. Then the brass, that particular clink of metal fittings on a wagon built to impress. The same sound that had cut through the auction crowd 6 weeks ago. The sound money makes when it moves down a dirt road. His stomach pulled tight. He set down the pliers, pulled off the gloves, looked toward the road, dust, a dark-painted wagon, matched bay horses in harness, 2 riders flanking it on quarter horses, 1 on each side. Hired men. They sat their saddles the way hired men sit loose, bored, watching. Cobb. Elias walked to the cabin. His boots found the path by habit across the pasture, through the gap in the fence, up the slight rise to the back of the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Martha at the table. Her forearms were powdered white to the elbow. She was kneading dough pressing, folding, turning. Her lips moved. She was humming something. He couldn't make out the melody through the glass. Just the shape of it, low and steady. He had never heard her hum before. He didn't go inside. He walked around to the front of the cabin, stepped onto the porch, and stood. Ember followed him up the steps. The old dog pressed against his left leg. The fur along her spine lifted, not much, just enough. The wagon rolled into the yard and stopped. The matched bays stamped and blew. Dust settled on the marigold seedlings Martha had transplanted along the porch 2 days ago. Small, green, barely 4 inches tall. Cobb didn't step down. He sat on the wagon seat, reins in one hand, the other resting on his thigh. His hat was clean. His coat was brushed. His silver watch chain caught the afternoon light. "Brooks, Harlan, you've done some work on the place. Garden looks busy." Elias said nothing. Cobb shifted on the seat. The smile he produced was a shape arranged on a face, the way furniture is arranged in a room nobody lives in. "I hear you've got a nice arrangement up here. The Weaver girl cooking, cleaning, keeping things warm. She works the contract, same as the law says." The law. Cobb tasted the word like wine he didn't care for. "I talked to Judge Kessler in Prescott. He says the contract could be reviewed. Irregular circumstances, a single man, a young woman, no minister involved. Kessler thinks there might be grounds." "Judge Kessler owes you money. Harlan, everybody knows that." The hired men shifted on their horses. One looked at the other. Cobb's jaw tightened a small movement, the muscle bunching near his ear. "I'll make this plain." He leaned forward. The wagon seat creaked. "I talked to Bill Trask at the freight office. He won't haul your cattle come fall. I talked to Emmett Coyle at the feed store in Prescott. He's done extending your credit. And I'll talk to every hay broker and buyer between here and Flagstaff. You'll be eating that thistle by September." Elias stood. The porch boards were warm under his boots. His hands hung at his sides, loose, the fingers slightly curled. His heart was slamming. He could feel it in his ears, in his wrists, in the base of his throat, but his hands stayed where they were. Ember pressed harder against his leg. A low vibration moved through her body, not a growl. Not yet, just the machine winding up. "I've been eating bad cornbread for 4 years. Harlan, you think I'm scared of thistle?" Cobb stared at him. The smile was gone. In its place was the bewilderment of a man who pushes a door and finds it doesn't move. Men were supposed to flinch when Harlan Cobb made promises. Men were supposed to calculate, negotiate, give him part of what he wanted. This one stood on a warped porch in a faded coat and worn-through boot. The screen door opened, the spring stretched, the hinges swung, and Martha stepped out. Flour on her forearms to the elbow, dough still under her fingernails. She walked to the porch rail and put her hands on it, flower prints on the gray wood, and stood there. Not behind Elias, not in front of him, beside him. Her shoulder was 8 inches from his. She looked at Cobb the way she had looked at the hills from the auction platform level. Unblinking. From a place inside herself that no amount of money could reach. Ember moved. The old dog left Elias's leg and sat between them, facing the wagon, her cloudy eye and her clear eye both fixed on Cobb. The fur along her spine was flat now. She had made up her mind. 3 figures on a porch. Man, woman, dog. Cobb looked at them. His eyes moved from Elias to Martha to the dog, and back to Martha. His hand tightened on the reins. The leather creaked 5 seconds, 10. The bays shifted. Stamping flies, one of the hired men coughed. Cobb picked up the reins with both hands. You'll regret this. Brooks. Maybe. But not today. The wagon turned. The wheels cut into the dirt yard. The hired men followed. Single file. Their horses' hooves close enough to the marigold seedlings that dust sifted over the small green leaves. Then they were on the road. Then dust. Then gone. Elias's hands were shaking. He put them in his pockets. The tremor ran up his forearms, into his shoulders. He pressed his fists against his thighs through the pocket lining and stood and breathed and waited for his body to stop doing what his mind hadn't given it permission to do. Martha went inside. He heard the stove grate, the coffee pot, the clink of tin. She came back, carrying 2 mugs. Sat on the porch step beside him. He'd sat down without noticing. Or maybe she'd moved without him noticing. He wasn't sure which. She held out a mug. He took it. The tin rattled once against his teeth. Your hands, she said. They'll stop. I know. Drink your coffee. He drank. The coffee was hot and bitter, and his throat worked against it, and the mug shook, and Martha sat beside him, and drank hers, and Ember lay across both their feet, and the crickets started up one by one. The sky turned. The dust on the road had settled. The marigold seedlings along the porch stood where they'd been planted, small and green and still alive. Martha set her mug on the step. He meant it, she said. About the freight office, about the feed store. I know. What happens if nobody buys your cattle in the fall? Elias looked at the south pasture. 14 head. Barely enough to keep the place running in a good year. In a year where nobody would haul them to market. They were just mouths to feed. I'll figure something out. That's not a plan. Elias. It was the first time she'd said his name. He looked at her. She was looking at the south pasture, too, at the same 14 head. Doing the same arithmetic. Arriving at the same number. Through the open kitchen window, the bread dough Martha had abandoned sat on the table, rising. The feed store in Prescott was the first. Martha drove the buckboard 12 miles east on a Monday to buy winter oats for the cattle. Emmett Coyle's store. The only feed supplier between the territory line and Flagstaff. She tied the mule at the rail, walked in. The bell didn't ring. It had been removed from the door, or maybe it had never been there. The store smelled like grain dust and burlap, and the vinegar tang of horse liniment. Coyle was behind the counter, a thin man, balding, with a ledger open in front of him. He looked up when Martha came in. His eyes moved to the window, to the buckboard, to the Brooks brand on the mule's harness strap. "Miss Weaver, I need 40 pounds of winter oats and a salt block, if you have one." Coyle closed the ledger, set his pen across it. The pen was new brass nib, bone handle, a pen bought with somebody else's money, or at least under somebody else's influence. "I can't do that," he said. "Can't or won't?" Coyle looked at the ledger, at the counter, at a spot on the wall behind Martha's head. "We're not extending credit to the Brooks account right now. Store policy." "Since when?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The answer was in the new pen and the closed ledger, and the way his eyes wouldn't settle on hers. The answer had a name, and the name owned a silver watch chain and matched bay horses. Martha stood at the counter. Her hands were flat on the wood. She pressed her fingers down until the nails went white. The heat in her face was not embarrassment. It was the thing that comes before. The thing that has teeth. "All right," she said. She walked out, climbed onto the buckboard, drove 12 miles back with an empty wagon bed and the sun in her face, and nothing to show for the day but dust on her dress, and the knowledge that Cobb's words had weight after all. She told Elias at supper. He ate his beans, set down his fork, looked at the table. "I'll talk to Harold," he said. "Harold can't carry us forever. His tab's already longer than my arm." "I know. So what do we do?" Elias picked up his fork, put it down again, picked up his mug. The coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. "We do what we can with what we've got," he said. "There's grass for the cattle. Gardens producing. We don't need Prescott." Martha looked at him. He was staring at the mug in his hands. And she understood that the man who had stood on the porch and told Harlan Cobb he wasn't scared of Thistle was now sitting at this table doing the math and finding out what Thistle actually tasted like. The storm came 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon in late August. Martha was in the garden tying tomato plants to the cottonwood stakes. The vines were heavy, fat, green tomatoes, pulling the stems sideways. She smelled it first. The air changed, temperature dropping, pressure dropping, the sky south of the hills going the color of a bruise. Elias came around the corner of the cabin, looked at the sky, looked at the garden. "Get the stakes tied. I'll trench the rows." He grabbed the spade and ran to the far end of the garden. Martha worked the tie's fingers looping twine, knotting stems to stakes, first row, second. The wind picked up. It smelled like wet dust and something metallic. The first drops hit her shoulders, big, warm, the size of nickels. Then the circles ran together, and she was soaked, and the rain was driving sideways into her face. She kept tying. Third row, the twine was slick. Her fingers slipped, and she knotted the same stake twice, and had to undo it. Elias was trenching. The spade threw mud. The drainage channels filled as fast as he dug them. His right boot sank to the ankle. He pulled it free, with a sound like a cork, and the mud left a dark ring on his trouser leg. The rain doubled. Martha couldn't see the hills. She could see Elias, a shape, 20 feet away, digging, and the garden going to mud around her. A squash vine lifted. The water caught it underneath, and peeled it up from the soil. Martha grabbed it, both hands. She pushed the roots back into the mud, scooping wet earth with her palms. The mud was thick and cold between her fingers. A stake gave way. Third row, the one she'd just tied. The tomato plant leaned, and the weight of the wet fruit pulled it sideways, and the whole thing went into the mud. Green tomatoes scattered in the brown water. Martha went after them on her knees. The mud took her weight and held it. Her skirt soaked through. Her knees sank. She gathered tomatoes against her chest, mud printing brown smears on the calico. She reached for one that had rolled under the bean fence. Her hand slipped. Her elbow buckled. She went down forearm, chest, cheek, against the mud. The cold pressed through her dress and against her skin, and she was lying in the garden she had planted. In the dirt, she had pressed with her palm seed by seed. And the rain was beating on her back, and the mud was on her face, and she could taste it gritty, metallic, the taste of earth that doesn't care who you are. She pushed herself up. Her arms shook, mud on her face, her neck, her chest. She looked down at herself, dress black with water and earth, hands unrecognizable, knees buried. From the auction platform to this, standing above a crowd in her one good dress to kneeling in mud with dirt in her mouth. Auction girl. Mrs. Garfield's voice, that round pronunciation, savored like hard candy, playing house. Martha's jaw clenched. She spit mud, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, which only moved the mud from one place to another. She got one knee up, then the other. She stood. Elias was beside her, boots buried to the laces, shirt plastered to his chest. He was holding the fallen stake. Take the other end. She took it. They drove it back into the ground together, Elias holding the top, Martha guiding the base, both pushing until the wood bit deep enough to hold. He tied the plant while she braced the stake. The twine was soaked. His fingers slipped. He cursed the knot under his breath. Hold it, he said. Don't let go. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her, mud-covered, hair in dark ropes along her jaw, dress ruined, holding the stake with both fists, feet planted wide in the mud, not letting go. He tied the last knot. The rain eased. The drumming on the cabin roof slowed. The water in the trenches was still running, but the level was dropping. Martha let go of the stake slowly. One finger at a time, it held. She looked at the garden. 2 squash vines uprooted. 1 row of beans flattened. But the tomato stakes stood. The marigold border was beaten flat orange petals crushed into the mud, but the roots held. The stems bent, but didn't break. Martha wiped her cheek, looked at the mud on her hand, looked at him. You've got... She pointed at his forehead. What? Half the garden, on your face. He reached up, touched his forehead. His hand came away black. Something happened to his face. The muscles around his eyes tightened, and his mouth pulled sideways, and a sound came out of him low, rough, rusty. He was laughing. The laugh of a man who has forgotten how and is remembering in real time. Martha's chest cracked open and she was laughing too, bent over, hands on her mud-caked knees, laughing at the garden and the rain and the mud and the man standing in it, and the old dog on the dry porch watching them like they'd both lost their minds. They laughed until it ran out. Then they stood in the dripping garden, catching their breath. The sun pushed through a crack in the clouds. Steam rose from the mud. Elias drove the spade into the ground. "I'll check the fence line. Water might have taken out a post. I'll start on the beans." He nodded, turned. "Martha," she looked at him. "We'll replant what we lost." She nodded. He walked toward the south pasture. Ember jumped off the porch and followed. Picking her way around puddles, Martha knelt in the mud. She righted the first bean plant, packed soil around its base with her palm the same press, seed by seed. The mud on her hands and face dried in the returning sun. She didn't wipe it off. Then she heard it, from the road. Wheels lighter than cobs, a single horse. A voice she knew. "Hello, the house. It's Harold. I was coming to check on you when I saw the storm roll in. Figured you'd need something." Harold's wagon carried two things, a 50-pound sack of winter wheat seed and a jar of plum preserves sealed with wax. He climbed down slow, his bad hip making the process a negotiation between his body and gravity. Ember greeted him with a tail wag and a sneeze. Harold looked at Martha, mud-covered, hair loose, dress black from collar to hem, and looked at the battered garden behind her. "Storm hit us in town, too. Took the awning off the feed store." He patted the wheat sack. "Figured you'd need this, and these," he held up the jar. The preserves were dark purple, catching the late light. "Ruth put these up the year before she passed. Found them in the back of the cellar. She'd want them used." Martha took the jar. The glass was cool, the wax seal unbroken. "Thank you. Harold." Elias came back from the fence line. Boots muddy to the calf, the spade over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw the wagon. Harold looked at the garden, the standing stakes, the replanted beans, the marigold border beaten but holding. "You've been working this place," Harold said. "Some, more than some." His eyes moved to the tomato rows, the drainage trenches, the squash vines that had survived because two people had held them down in the mud. Margaret would have liked those marigolds, even flat like that. She always said they were stubborn flowers. Elias looked at the flattened marigolds whose stems were already bending back toward the light. "Yeah, she would have." Harold nodded. He climbed back onto his wagon with the same slow effort. At the road, he turned. "One more thing. Cobb took his case to Judge Kessler. About the contract." Harold adjusted the reins. "Kessler looked at the paperwork, said the contract's clean, told Cobb he had no standing and to stop wasting the court's time." The cane tapped the wagon bed. "Harlan didn't take it well. But that's the end of it, legally speaking." He raised one hand without looking back. The wagon creaked away. Elias stood in the yard. The air smelled like wet earth and the first green smell of things starting over. He stood there while Martha carried the wheat seed to the barn and the preserves to the kitchen, and Ember lay on the porch, watching him with her one clear eye. The weeks after the storm were quiet. Through September, the garden came back, not the way it was before, but different, tougher. The tomato plants that survived bore fruit that ripened slow, turning from green to orange to a deep, splitting red by late September, heavy on the vine. The bean runners climbed the new fence Elias built from cottonwood poles, hanging thick with pods that dried brown in the heat. The squash vines Martha replanted spread wider than the first planting, hiding yellow squash underneath like eggs in a nest. The marigolds came back tallest. The border blazed orange around the garden's edge, brighter than before, as if the beating had woken something in the roots. Elias left fabric on the kitchen table, the way he left everything without a note. Blue cotton folded next to the sugar tin, and a packet of pins beside it. Harold's tab was getting longer. Neither of them mentioned it. Martha found the fabric on a Wednesday morning, held it to the kitchen window, ran it between her fingers, good cotton, tight weave. She cut it by lamplight, sewed it in 2 evenings, pin-tucking the bodice the way her mother had taught her before her mother got sick and couldn't hold a needle. The finished dress fit the way a good dress fits. Sunday. The buckboard on the road to town. Martha in the blue dress. Elias in his cleanest shirt. Ember between them on the bench seat. The church bell rang once as they pulled up to Harold's store, marking the hour. The sound hung in the air old bronze, the same bell that had rung every Sunday since the town was a settlement and the church was a tent. Elias tied the mule. Martha stepped down and walked through the front door, and the bell jingled, and she stood in the store where Mrs. Garfield had called her a name that tasted like metal. She stood the way she'd stood on the platform chin level, eyes steady. But her hands were different. The hands on the platform had been shaking in her pockets. These hands were sun-brown and garden-calloused, and they hung at her sides, and they were still. Harold introduced her to Clara, the new schoolteacher from back east. They talked about seeds, what grew in this soil, when to plant winter vegetables. Clara asked about the marigolds. Martha told her they kept the beetles away. Mrs. Dalton came in carrying honey from her husband's hives. She set the jar on the counter. "For you," she said. "Welcome gift. Should have brought it sooner." "Thank you, Eleanor." Through the store window, Martha saw Cobb ride past on a chestnut gelding. He looked at the buckboard, looked at the store. His eyes found Martha through the glass. He didn't slow, didn't tip his hat, didn't turn his head. He rode past, looking straight ahead, the way a man rides past a thing he has decided not to see. Harold saw it, Elias, standing on the porch. Saw it. Nobody spoke about it. A man who refuses to see what's in front of him has accepted something he cannot say aloud. That evening, Martha walked to the meadow beyond the garden. September light slow gold, making everything look like something worth remembering. Columbine grew along the creek bank, blue and white. Indian paintbrush stood in patches on the slope, orange-red. She picked a handful, mixed the blue with the orange, turning the stems until the colors pushed against each other, carried them inside. Set them on the kitchen table in a mason jar filled with creek water. The flowers leaned left. She straightened them. They leaned left again. She left them. Elias came in from the barn. He'd been checking the wheat seed, measuring it against the 10 acres of flat ground north of the cabin, the ground Margaret had always said would grow wheat if anyone bothered to try. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The table was set for supper. 2 plates, 2 mugs, cornbread Martha's, golden, steaming, beans with salt pork, the plum preserves, opened, a spoon standing in them, and in the center, wildflowers in a mason jar. Leaning left, Martha poured coffee, set his mug at his place, sat across from him. Elias didn't sit. He stood in the doorway and looked at the flowers. His jaw moved, not chewing, not speaking, just the muscles working beneath the skin. Margaret kept flowers on this table, every week from May to October, wild flowers in a mason jar, never a vase. She didn't own one. The flowers always leaned. She'd laughed about it, said they had opinions. Martha waited. The coffee steamed. Ember was asleep by the stove. Elias sat, wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was going cold. "You're looking at those flowers like they said something to you," Martha said. He looked at the mug, at the kitchen that smelled like bread and pine smoke and plum preserves, at the woman sitting where another woman used to sit. "I forgot." He stopped. His throat moved. "It's been a long time since this place felt like—" He couldn't finish. His mouth closed. He shook his head once. Looked at the flowers. Martha didn't move. She didn't lean forward. She sat with her coffee and waited the way you wait for a deer at the edge of a clearing. Elias drank his cold coffee, pushed back from the table. "Wheat needs to go in next week." "I know. I'll help." He walked to the door, put his hand on the frame. His fingers pressed into the wood tendons standing out, the effort of holding something in or letting something out. "The flowers are good," he said. He went through the screen door. His boots crossed the porch. The rocking chair creaked once, twice, then the slow rhythm, and the crickets, and Ember's breathing by the stove. Martha sat at the table. 2 cold mugs, wildflowers tilting left. She pressed her hand flat against the pine surface the grain Margaret had oiled. The surface Martha had scrubbed clean. The wood was warm. He'd almost said it. Whatever lived at the end of that sentence, the word behind his teeth that wouldn't come. She picked up both mugs, washed them, set them upside down to dry. Through the window, the rocking chair moving, the shape of a man looking at the hills. Beside the rocker, the straight-backed chair sat empty. Hers. She dried her hands, untied her apron, hung it on the hook. Then she stopped. Her eyes were on the shelf above the stove. Beside the Bible, something she hadn't noticed before. A small wooden frame, turned face down, lying flat behind the coffee tin. She'd dusted that shelf a dozen times. Martha reached up, turned the frame over, a photograph, a woman, dark hair parted in the center, a white collar. A face that was not beautiful in any obvious way, but held something in the set of the mouth and the steadiness of the eyes that made you look twice. Martha held the frame, looked at the woman who had stitched the quilt she slept under, who had planted the marigolds, who had oiled this table and sat in the chair that creaked on the porch where a man rocked alone. She set the photograph upright, facing out, where it belonged. Then she went to the porch and sat in her chair, and neither of them spoke, and the night came down, and somewhere in her pocket the watch sat still, waiting for something it couldn't name. Sheriff Burrell came on a Tuesday in late November, riding a sorrel mare that picked her way up the road like she had opinions about mud. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow bright, papery gold against a gray sky, and the leaves were falling straight down in the still air. Martha was on the porch, shelling beans into a tin bowl. Ember lifted her head, sniffed, and her tail moved once. She knew the mare. Burrell dismounted the way he did everything slow, deliberate, his arthritic knees taking each stage as a separate problem, He landed with a grunt, tied the mare to the porch rail. Ember came down and sneezed against his boot. "Morning, girl." He scratched behind the gray ear, straightened, looked at Martha. "Miss Weaver?" "Sheriff." He reached inside his coat, pulled out a folded document, heavy paper. The county seal pressed in red wax. He unfolded it on the porch rail, smoothing the creases. Elias came from the barn. He'd been sharpening the plow blade. Martha had heard the rasp of metal on stone all morning, steady as the creak of the rocking chair. He walked across the yard and stopped at the foot of the steps. Burl read, "Martha Weaver has fulfilled the terms of labor contract dated May 27th, 1887. The debt of $52 is cleared in full. The contracted party is hereby discharged of all obligation." He looked up. "That's the official language. What it means is plain enough." He folded the paper, held it out. "You're a free woman, Miss Weaver. Go wherever you please." Martha set the bowl of beans on the chair, took the document. It was heavier than she expected. She folded it once, put it in her apron pocket, next to the watch. Burl looked at Elias. Elias leaned against the porch post. His arms were crossed. He was looking at the wheat field beyond the north fence, 10 acres plowed and harrowed. Winter wheat 3 weeks in, green rows pushing through brown soil in lines so straight they looked drawn with a ruler. Nobody said anything. Burl settled his hat. "All right, then." He climbed back up with the same slow effort. In the saddle. He looked at both of them, the woman on the porch, the man on the steps, the old dog between them. "Good luck to both of you." He touched the brim, turned the mare, rode down the road until he was a small shape against the yellow cottonwoods. And then he was gone. Martha went to her room, the narrow bed, the corn husk mattress that had learned the shape of her body, the hollow where her hip settled, the dip where her shoulder pressed, the blue and white quilt, worn soft, the stitching familiar under her fingers, the kerosene lamp on the crate, the chimney glass she'd cleaned every Saturday, the wick she'd trimmed every night. The window faced east. She'd watched the sun come up through it 180 mornings. She knew the exact moment the light hit the sill. She knew which bird sang first, the meadowlark. Always. 2 rising notes before the rest of the world remembered it had a voice. She sat on the bed. The corn husks rustled. She reached into her apron pocket, past the discharge paper. Her fingers found the watch. The gold plating was worn. 6 months of handling had rubbed the finish thin, showing base metal underneath. The chain was still broken. The face still read 417. She wound it. The crown turned under her thumb 1 rotation. 2. 3. The familiar resistance. Tick. Her hand stopped. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was small, smaller than a heartbeat, smaller than a whisper, but she heard it the way you hear your own name called across a field. The second hand moved, past the 6, past the 7, climbing toward the 8. 15 seconds. 20. The minute hand shuddered and advanced 1 notch. 4:18. 25. 30. 35. The ticking slowed. The second hand dragged. Stopped. Dragged. 40 seconds. The spring winding down. The gears remembering and forgetting at the same time. It stopped. The second hand rested between the 9 and the 10. 4:18. Martha closed her hand around the case. The metal was warm. The ticking was gone, but the vibration lingered in her palm. She could go east, Prescott, laundry work, boarding houses, owe nothing. The contract didn't hold her. The debt was paid. She could walk out the door and down the road, and the watch would still read 4:18, and nothing in this cabin would follow her. Except the quilt, the lamp, the table, the garden she'd planted and held down in the mud with her bare hands, the coffee every morning, the Bible in the dark, the photograph she'd turned face out on the shelf, the man who'd said her name in the rain like it was something he'd been carrying in his pocket and had finally found a reason to take out. Martha put the watch in her pocket, stood, smoothed the quilt, straightened the lamp, looked at the room one more time. She went to the kitchen, mourning. The wheat field was a green haze against the brown hills. The creek caught the first light and threw it back in pieces. A red-tail hawk circled high and slow, its shadow crossing the pasture. Elias sat in the rocking chair, coffee in his tin mug, ember at his feet. The rocker moved in its slow rhythm creak. Pause. Creak. The screen door opened. Martha came out carrying 2 mugs. She handed him one, fresh, hot, steam curling in the cool air. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch, but the heat passed between them. She sat in her chair. The straight-backed one, hers. They looked at the land. Martha drank, set the mug on the rail. The tin clicked against wood. Wheat looks good. Coming in strong. You'll need help come spring. Plowing, planting, the garden again. The rocker creaked. I suppose I will. Martha picked up her mug, blew on the coffee. The steam moved sideways and dissolved. Well then. Ember yawned long, slow, showing every tooth she had left. She stretched and stood and turned once and lay down again. This time she put her chin on Martha's boot. The weight of the old gray head settled against the leather, and Ember sighed and closed her eyes. Martha reached down, fingers behind the ear where the fur was softest. Ember's tail moved once against the boards. In the meadow beyond the wheat field, a meadowlark called. 2 rising notes, then 3. The sound crossed the morning air and hung there clear, unhurried, the way a sentence sounds when it doesn't need finishing. The rocker creaked. The coffee steamed. The hawk wheeled once more and was gone. Martha's hand rested on Ember's head. Her other hand rested on the arm of her chair, in her pocket. The watch read 4:18 1 minute past where it had been frozen for 9 months. Not much, not everything. But the spring had caught, and the gears had turned, and for 40 seconds the mechanism had remembered what it was built to do. The cottonwood leaves fell gold and silent. The wheat field stretched green to the fence line. The garden harvested, spent. The marigold stalks, dry and brown, held its shape in the soil. Waiting for spring, Martha drank her coffee. Elias rocked his chair. Ember breathed against her boot. The morning was warm for November. The hills were close and blue and quiet, and the light moved across the land the way a hand moves across a table it knows by heart. There is something heavy sitting in the chest after a story like this. Not sadness, exactly, Something quieter than that. Something that stays the way a hand stays on a kitchen table. Warm. Familiar, not quite ready to move. Many of us have carried what Elias carried. That silence after someone leaves a room for the last time. The chair we couldn't sit in. The name we couldn't say. Some of us have stood where Martha stood, on a platform or a doorstep or at a crossroads, holding ourselves together with nothing but the set of our jaw and whatever small thing we kept in our pocket. We have loved without saying so. We have been loved by people whose kindness arrived without a note. Not all of that got spoken aloud. Not all of it needed to be. It is all right to let this story rest exactly where it landed. It does not need to be wrapped up or explained or carried any further than this. Some things just sit beside you for a while, like an old dog's chin on your boot, and that is enough. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening all the way to the last creak of the rocking chair.